propaganda of the deed is specific political action meant to be exemplary to others. It is primarily associated with acts of left terrorism of the late 19th and early 20th century, but also had non-violent applications. Anarchist origins. Various definitions. One of the first individuals to conceptualize propaganda by the deed was the Italian revolutionary Carlo Pisacane, who wrote in his Political Testament that ideas spring from deeds and not the other way around. Mikhail Bakunin, in his Letters to a Frenchman on the Present Crisis, stated that we must spread our principles, not with words but with deeds. For this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. The concept, in a broader setting, has a rich heritage. As the words of Francis of Assisi reveal, let them show their love by the works they do for each other, according as the Apostle says, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Some anarchists, such as Johann Most, advocated publicizing violent acts of retaliation against counter-revolutionaries because we preach not only action in and for itself, but also action as propaganda. Most was an early influence on American anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Berkman attempted propaganda by the deed when he tried in 1892 to kill industrialist Henry Clay Frick following the deaths by shooting of several striking workers. By the 1880s, the slogan, propaganda of the deed, had begun to be used both within and outside of the anarchist movement to refer to individual bombings, regicides and tyrannicides. In 1886, French anarchist Clement Duval achieved a form of propaganda of the deed, stealing 15,000 francs from the mansion of a Parisian socialite, before accidentally setting the house on fire. Caught 2 weeks later, he was dragged from the court crying, "Long live anarchy," and condemned to death. Duval's sentence was later commuted to hard labor on Devil's Island, French Guiana. In the anarchist paper Révolte, Duval famously declared that theft exists only through the exploitation of man by man. When society refuses you the right to exist, you must take it. The policeman arrested me in the name of the law, I struck him in the name of liberty. As early as 1887, a few important figures in the anarchist movement had begun to distance themselves from individual acts of violence. A variety of anarchists advocated the abandonment of these sorts of tactics in favor of collective revolutionary action, for example through the trade union movement. The anarcho-syndicalist Fernand Pelloutier argued in 1895 for renewed anarchist involvement in the labor movement on the basis that anarchism could do very well without the individual dynamiter. State repression of the anarchist and labor movements following the few successful bombings and assassinations may have contributed to the abandonment of these kinds of tactics. Although reciprocally state repression, in the first place, may have played a role in these isolated acts, the dismemberment of the French socialist movement into many groups and, following the suppression of the 1871 Paris Commune, the execution and exile of many communards to penal colonies, favored individualist political expression and acts. Anarchist historian Max Nettelaar provided a more complex concept of propaganda when he said that every person is likely to be open to a different kind of argument, so propaganda cannot be diversified enough if we want to touch all. We want it to pervade and penetrate all the utterances of life, social and political, domestic and artistic, educational and recreational. There should be propaganda by word and action, the platform and the press, the street corner, the workshop, and the domestic circle, acts of revolt, and the example of our own lives as free men. Those who agree with each other may cooperate, otherwise they should prefer to work each on his own lines to trying to persuade one the other of the superiority of his own method. Later anarchist authors advocating propaganda of the deed included the German anarchist Gustav Landauer, and the Italians Enrico Malatesta and Luigi Galliena. For Gustav Landauer, Propaganda of the deed meant the creation of libertarian social forms and communities that would inspire others to transform society. In Weak Statesman, Weaker People, he wrote that the state is not something that one can smash in order to destroy. The state is a relationship between human beings. One destroys it by entering into other relationships. In contrast, Enrico Malatesta described propaganda by the deed as violent communal insurrections that were meant to ignite the imminent revolution. However, Malatesta himself denounced the use of terrorism and violent physical force, stating in one of his essays, "Violence used to another's hurt, which is the most brutal form of struggle between men can assume, is eminently corrupting. It tends, by its very nature, to suffocate the best sentiments of man, and to develop all the antisocial qualities, ferocity, hatred, revenge, the spirit of domination and tyranny, contempt of the weak, servility towards the strong. And this harmful tendency arises also when violence is used for a good end. Anarchists who rebel against every sort of oppression and struggle for the integral liberty of each, and who ought thus to shrink instinctively from all acts of violence which cease to be mere resistance to oppression and become oppressive in their turn, are also liable to fall into the abyss of brutal force." The excitement caused by some recent explosions in the admiration for the courage with which the bomb throwers faced death suffices to cause many anarchists to forget their program, and to enter on a path which is the most absolute negation of all anarchist ideas and sentiments. At the other extreme, the anarchist Luigi Galliano, perhaps the most vocal proponent of propaganda by the deed from the turn of the century through the end of the First World War, took undisguised pride in describing himself as a subversive, a revolutionary propagandist, an advocate of the violent overthrow of established government and institutions through the use of direct action, i.e., bombings and assassinations. Galliano heartily embraced physical violence and terrorism, not only against symbols of the government and the capitalist system, such as courthouses and factories, but also through direct assassination of enemies of the people, capitalists, industrialists, politicians, judges, and policemen. He had a particular interest in the use of bombs, going so far as to include a formula for the explosive nitroglycerine in one of his pamphlets advertised through his monthly magazine, Kronika Subversiva. By all accounts, Galliano was an extremely effective speaker and advocate of his policy of violent action, attracting a number of devoted Italian-American anarchist followers who called themselves Gallianists. Carlo Buda, the brother of Gallianist bomb-maker Mario Buda, said of him, "You heard Galliano speak, and you were ready to shoot the first policeman you saw." Illegalism. Propaganda of the deed is also related to illegalism, an anarchist philosophy that developed primarily in France, Italy, Belgium, and Switzerland during the early 20th century as an outgrowth of anarchist individualism. The illegalists openly embraced criminality as a lifestyle. Influenced by theorist Max Stirner's concept of egoism, the illegalists broke from anarchists like Clement Duval and Marius Jacob, who justified theft with a theory of individual reclamation. Instead, the illegalists argued that their actions required no moral basis. Illegal acts were taken not in the name of a higher ideal, but in pursuit of one's own desires. France's Bonnet Gang was the most famous group to embrace illegalism. Relationship to revolution. Propaganda of the deed thus included stealing, rioting and general strikes which aimed at creating the conditions of an insurrection or even a revolution. These acts were justified as the necessary counterpart to state repression. As early as 1911, Leon Trotsky condemned individual acts of violence by anarchists as useful for little more than providing an excuse for state repression. The anarchist prophets of the propaganda by the deed can argue all they want about the elevating and stimulating influence of terrorist acts on the masses. He wrote in 1911, Theoretical considerations and political experience prove otherwise. Vladimir Lenin largely agreed, viewing individual anarchist acts of terrorism as an ineffective substitute for coordinated action by disciplined cadres of the masses. Sociologist Max Weber wrote that the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force, or, in Karl Marx's words, the state was only the repressive apparatus of the bourgeois class. Propaganda by the deed, including assassinations, were thus legitimized by part of the anarchist movement and the First International as a valid means to be used in class struggle. The predictable state responses to these actions were supposed to display to the people the inherently repressive nature of the bourgeois state. This would in turn bolster the revolutionary spirit of the people, leading to the overthrow of the state. This is the basic formula of the cycle: protests, repression, protests, which in specific conditions may lead to an effective state of insurrection. This cycle has been observed during the 1905 Russian Revolution or in Paris in May 1968. However, it failed to achieve its revolutionary objective on the vast majority of occasions, thus leading to the abandonment by the vast majority of the anarchist movement of such bombings. However, the state never failed in its repressive response, enforcing various lower-scale rates which usually involved tough clampdowns on the whole of the labor movement. These harsh laws, sometimes accompanied by the proclamation of the state of exception, progressively led to increased criticism among the anarchist movement of assassinations, the role of several agents provocateurs and the use of deliberate strategies of tension by governments, using such false-flag terrorist actions as the Spanish La Mano Negra, worked to discredit this violent tactic in the eyes of most socialist libertarians. John Phillis and Jim Bell are two of the best-known modern advocates, with the latter developing the concept of an assassination market, a market system for anonymously hiring and compensating political assassination.